Welcome to Conversing on Africa's Peace. This is a monthly podcast that is organized by Amani Africa Media and Research Services in collaboration with the Australian Embassy in Addis Ababa. Today we don't have Adam with us, he is on leave. So it would be myself, Solomon Ayel Derso, founding director of Amani Africa, sitting with Bitania Taddese, Amani Africa's director of programs, to give us her reflections on the monthly program of work of the Peace and Security Council for the month of April, as we have been doing in previous editions. Welcome to the podcast, Bitania.
Thank you so much, Salomon. Great to be here.
Excellent. This is April 2023, the month during which Tunisia is chairing the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. The monthly program of work is accordingly organized under Tunisia's chairship. Before we proceed, I think it would be good to observe, perhaps into the specific details, if you can provide us an overview of the items that are on the program of work of the PSC for the month of April, and then we'll come to the specifics later.
Thank you again, Salomon. It's really great to do this monthly podcast and to also reflect on some of the works that we do on the PSC and its activities during the month. And when it comes to the program of work for the month of April, there are some very interesting agenda items that have been tabled for this month, including country and region-specific sessions, but also thematic sessions. In addition to that, there's going to be the retreat, the 15th retreat of the PSC, which are all taking place during this month. In addition to the formal kind of official sessions, of course, there is one planned informal session that is taking place during this month. And in addition to the ambassadorial meetings, there is also going to be the sessions at the military staff committee level as well. And there's one, of course, planned ministerial session on Libya planned for the month.
Great. As you said, I think there is both thematic sessions, some of which are actually relating to the statutory meetings of the PSC. For example, the one on the 6th of April, and the very first one that was held on mine action in Africa. Can you give us your take on the importance of the thematic agenda items?
Yes, so as you stated, this is a standing agenda item for the PSC, both the one taking place, the one that was held the first week of April on the International Day of Mine Awareness and Assistance in Mine Action, which is something that is observed annually at the PSC level as well. And it has become a standing session, and it has convened various sessions. The PSC has convened a number of sessions specifically in relation to this thematic agenda. And it's also very much relevant given the kind of, the increasing use of anti-personnel landmines, including the use, of course, of IEDs that has been very much like a major threat, security threat that has been that has become a defining feature in many of the conflicts and violent conflicts in the continent. The use of this weapons by non-state armed groups and terrorist organizations. So it makes the session quite relevant to the current insecurity, to the current conflict situations that are within the continent. But also when it comes to the second standing agenda item, particularly on the prevention of ideology of hate, genocide and hate crimes in Africa, this is another agenda item which the PSC has been seized with for quite some time. This session also is important not only in commemorating the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, but also to ensure that there is no denialism when it comes to this specific kind of mass atrocities, and that to prevent any kind of denialism of history, but also in terms of strengthening early warning mechanisms, prevention, so to ensure that this does not happen again. So it has different kind of purposes when the PSC holds this kind of sessions. Of course, this commemoration does not only take place at the PSC level, but it's more more broadly at the Commission level, and involving a wide range of stakeholders to really commemorate this particular part of history, but also to reflect further when we think about how to prevent this kind of mass atrocities.
Aman Africa produced analysis on the International Day on Mine Awareness and Assistance in Mine Action. You touched on the importance of this topic in the current peace and security context of the continent. Can you please provide us some data that indicates why mines remain to be a very serious threat to the safety and security of people on the continent? My understanding is that these are issues that are current in a number of conflict situations on the continent. I had highlighted in Amani Africa's analysis in this respect. Where are these places where these mines, as well as improvised explosive devices, are in prevalent use on the continent currently?
So, as highlighted in our insights, we touched upon on the various conflict situations that have been particularly affected by the use of these weapons, including, of course, Mali, CAR. So the countries that we actually expect to be affected by this kind of anti-personnel mines used by non-state groups, non-state armed groups that are operating within these regions, particularly, of course, the Sahel, but also emerging conflict hotspots, including in Mozambique, in the Cabo Delgado region as well. So we have existing conflict situations that are highly affected by this, but also new and emerging regions and areas that are increasingly being susceptible to the use of IEDs.
Great. I think looking at the months of April, I think this is 2 years, or perhaps this is the third year, actually, since the Peace and Security Council in April 2020 shifted from an in-person meeting to meeting in the virtual space. And it's interesting that it is during this month that the Peace and Security Council actually returned back to the in-person meeting. Why is this significant for the work of the PSC?
I mean, this is when the first time when this online or virtual space was first introduced, it was because of the specific circumstances that the PSC, but largely the world, was facing. And that somehow, of course, really affected the work of the PSC, because the kind of interactions that normally we have with within the council members themselves, but also with various stakeholders and actors that engage the PSC, was interrupted because of the absence of that physical presence of PSC members, but also to interact more more proactively even for various PSC members. I think having that in-person meeting, it's easier for PSC members to deliberate, but also to have more in-depth discussions, which is easier to do it in person. And this is quite significant for the PSC to really return to this in-person meeting Also because for quite some time, with this virtual space, it somehow also curtailed PSC's engagement with the wider stakeholders, which it used to interact more deeply when there are open sessions, for example. And that was affected by this virtual space. Of course, it has its own advantages for the PSC to really pursue and to continue with its meetings, to have its standing meetings. It's easier. But at the same time, there was something that was lost, that element of in-person discussions with member states. And also, I mean, there are new members that have joined the PSC during this time. And the PSC, of course, there are other activities that were taking place in person, but it creates much more intimacy and closeness when there is this regular in-person session.
Great. Indeed, as you said, the current configuration of the membership of the Peace and Security Council came into being after the election of the new members of the PSC in February 2022. So the new members actually have been operating in the online sessions of the Peace and Security Council, which is actually an exceptional provision rather than what is anticipated in the Peace and Security Council protocol, which actually expects and invites for an in-person meeting. So there is also a statutory dimension, of course, to the convening of the PSC session in person. Now looking at, I think, the program of work, coming back to the program of work, the other component of the program of work, as you mentioned, relates to country-specific situations. Can you take us through those country-specific situations and what we should expect from those sessions?
Absolutely. So interestingly, they are in the substantive or in the official, actually, part of the PSC agenda items. We have one focusing on Libya and one on the Sahel region.
Specifically, if I can intervene, on the Libya and the Sahel. On Libya, it is envisaged, as you rightly pointed out, that the meeting will be held at the level of ministers, indicating the importance of the situation in Libya to the chair of the MANS, Tunisia, as a neighboring country to Libya as well. What is the state of affair as far as the role of the African Union is concerned with respect to the situation in Libya and why this meeting is significant?
So the significance of AU's role, the significance of this session, particularly in relation to AU's role in the situation in Libya, one thing, there is a new kind of engagement or renewed engagement from the African Union side, because it was only in February where the PSC held a session on Libya under South Africa's chairship. So this will be the second time that the PSC will be holding another session. So there is, it has become much more frequent for the PSC to discuss the situation in Libya, but more broadly, not just the PSC, but the existing kind of structures. For example, the high-level ad hoc committee for Libya under Congo's leadership has been playing a very vital role in terms of supporting and facilitating as well the Libya's national reconciliation process. So that has been really the added value where the AU has stepped in. So this is where it also requires more coordinated and concerted efforts, even for the AU to also play, to continue to accompany Libyan actors and stakeholders in this process. So it's very interesting. In the last PSC session that was held in February, one of the things that also came up strongly, that is the need for the PSC to also undertake a field mission in Libya, which is very important, so that there is more direct engagement with the stakeholders on the ground, but also for it to happen ahead of the National Reconciliation Conference, so that there is a certain kind of momentum, but also there is the AU present even before this major process happens within Libya. So it's very interesting for the PSC to also have more frequent sessions on Libya.
It seems that this time around the AU seems to have a momentum towards the convening of this National Reconciliation Conference for Libya, on which the AU has taken a lead quite for some years now. But it's only in recent months that we have seen concrete action in terms of consultations held by the high-level ad hoc committee with various Libyan stakeholders. And as you indicated, also this has become a focus of the engagement of the PSC in the session that it held in February, which also facilitated actually the coordination of the Peace and Security Council's engagement with the special representative of the Secretary General on the situation in Libya, His Excellency Bahatili. So the expectation is that during the coming months, the AU would convene the National Reconciliation Conference, and perhaps that would be an important milestone in terms of the role of the AU in the situation in Libya. It would be interesting to see if indeed this National Reconciliation Conference would be convened as scheduled in the coming months, and indeed the discussions that would happen at the level of the ministerial meeting would give us a signal of whether indeed it would go ahead as planned during the coming months. In terms of, I think, the situation in the Sahel, this is one of the major hotspots on the continent. It is a conflict situation involving terrorist groups operating across different territories in the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, now even threatening to expand it to the coastal countries of West Africa. In some of the countries like Burkina Faso, of course, it seems that the situation is getting worse by the day, so much so that it is as if Burkina is going from the pan to the fire, the frying pan to the fire itself. So, given that the AU has been seized with and the PSC has been discussing the issues, what is going to be new? Is there going to be a new dimension to the discussion that the PSC will have as far as the situation in the Sahel is concerned?
The situation in the Sahel absolutely requires a new approach. One thing that the PSC, in the last session that took place in November on Sahel, one thing that the PSC definitely signaled is the need to broaden the policy toolkit when it comes to counterterrorism. So that's a very big step for the PSC. So that the response and the counterterrorism efforts in the Sahel is not only limited to military action. It's not only limited to military responses, but there is a need for a broader discussion that looks at the major drivers, the root causes that are really fueling the insecurity and the proliferation of terrorist groups in the region, which now there is a threat that it will expand beyond the Sahel region and to also affect other countries that have, of course, been stable in the past. So there is a major threat that will not limit itself specifically in the Sahel. So this kind of messaging from the PSC that recognizes that the limitation of previous responses that mainly focused on military action is a very good step. I mean, not to this is not to specifically say that the military response is not necessary, but is to ensure that such kind of actions are also anchored in broader political strategies, but also are further accompanied by various interventions in relation to governance, to socioeconomic developments, and to inclusion of marginalized groups that are that have really valid kind of grievances, and to really enhance the presence of the state in these marginalized territories, among these communities, to ensure that there is inclusive governance and the plight of these groups are well addressed. And that is those, those kind of multiple approaches that are way broader than the current system, the current interventions that are able to really deliver a very stable and peaceful kind of region in the Sahel. And at the moment, of course, this kind of interventions, to see the impact of this kind of interventions, really, it requires a lot of time. I mean, the impact is not immediate. The effort is a lot as well. But it's something that is definitely a need for a different direction in terms of counterterrorism in the Sahel, but more broadly, of course, in the African continent.
Just moving to another component of the program for the months, there is going to be a new addition to the working arrangement of the Peace and Security Council. Tunisia introduced the convening of informal consultation, which is actually put in the footnote of the program of work of the Peace and Security Council for the month. It's not something that is, put in the normal program of the Peace and Security Council. It is now scheduled for the 26th of April. It is worth noting that this is partly also come about on account of the it is one of the formats that is established in the Peace and Security Council protocol. If you look at Article 8, 11, and Rule 16 of the Rules of Procedure of the Peace and Security Council, informal consultations are to be held with parties concerned by or interested in a conflict or a situation, regional mechanisms, international organization, and CSOs. The holding of informal consultations, as we have pointed out in our Peace and Security Council handbook, has not been regularized. So in a way, it is a very interesting initiative whose importance would be tested for the first time in this month on the 26th of April. Can you provide us more in terms of what the background to this convening of informal consultation is, and also what the convening would entail?
So as you pointed out, it's a very interesting working method issue for the PSC to engage countries that have been suspended due to unconstitutional change of government. This is also something that the PSC deliberated during its 14th retreat, and that was held last year in November, which specifically had a provision on the need to engage the suspended countries and for them to engage the PSC, because in the formal setting, these 4 countries, namely Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan, won't be able to really interact with and engage the PSC. So this is a very interesting platform for the chair, Tunisia, to also provide this platform for these countries to engage the PSC. So it's an interesting follow-up from the retreat of the PSC that had the specific provision for these countries to engage the PSC. One thing that I would like to also to add here, during our engagement, of course, with the monthly chair, something that was very interesting that we heard from the PSC chair as well is that how this informal consultation that's really is bringing this 4 countries is also inspired but also guided by what we have indicated in our handbook when it comes to the working methods of the PSC. So it's also very interesting and encouraging for us as Amani as well to see members of the PSC utilizing this resource in terms of undertaking their mandates and in terms of discharging their mandate and the responsibilities as PSC chairs and of course PSC members as well.
Great. I think there will be no expectation of a formal outcome document from this informal consultation. It is being introduced, as you said, for purpose of addressing the challenge that the PSC faced following the suspension of these countries. They couldn't be able to participate in the formal sessions and activities of the African Union, including the Peace and Security Council. So the idea is basically for the PSC to find a way of, through an informal engagement, giving a hearing on the state of play in these countries, particularly those where the Peace and Security Council, for example, was unable to undertake field missions. And indeed, these are not the countries to which the PSC had undertaken field missions in the past year or so. Thank you very much, Bitania, for sharing your insights with us today in Conversing on the Peace and Security Council. We are very pleased once again to have this edition of the podcast bringing to you. I would like to thank all the staff of Amani Africa and Australia Embassy for this collaboration that brought to us the monthly podcast. Until next time, thank you very much to all of you for listening.